Hello, my name is Ian Watson, and I am a Director Emeritus of the American Membrane Technology Association, known fondly by some of us as AMTA. AMTA is a technical organization that advocates the use of membrane technology for water treatment ranging from wastewater reclamation and reuse to seawater desalination and membrane filtration. The heart of the technology is the membrane and the systems that are assembled around it to produce a final unit operation. And about 3 years ago, the board of directors of AMTA decided that we should record the history of the technology through the eyes of the pioneers that blazed the trail. This is a continuation of our series Chats with the Pioneers, in which we are recording for posterity, or maybe longer, the efforts of the early pioneers in bringing membrane technology into the mainstream of water treatment. AMTA is posting these interviews on its website in the members-only section so that the next generations of engineers and scientists, and those of us that enjoy reminiscing about the good old days, can look at and listen to many of the people who were instrumental in bringing this technology to the worldwide position that it has today in providing safe, reliable water supplies to those in need. This series of 3 chats, this is the third, is with the past employees of Polymetrics, one of the legacy OEMs in the business. And this is Chat Group 30. With me today, I have Mr. Jim Sleigh, Mr. Mike Nelson, Mr. Walter Hayden. And Jim, if you would, could you give us a brief background of your education and experience?
Okay, I graduated from San Diego State. In 1958, I came to California to work for General Atomic. And in 1969, I was transferred into the reverse osmosis group. And that was called ROGA, Reverse Osmosis by General Atomic. And they were the developers of the spiral wound membrane. And I worked for them for 10 years, I think, and then went to work at the humid desalting test facility, and then came to work for Polymetrics after that.
Good, thank you. Mike?
I got my bachelor's in chemistry at Cal State across the bay, and then I immediately spent my obligatory 2 years in the Army at the time. And when I got out, I realized I wasn't so interested in the chemistry. I wanted to go into engineering, so I went back to San Jose State and got my master's in civil engineering. And at the time, that was also the point where I got associated with Polymetrics in 1972. Then I went on and got a doctorate in civil engineering from Stanford. But at the time, reverse osmosis was just something in a textbook. And they offered a job to one of the professors there at San Jose. And he wasn't interested in, and I wasn't interested in a job. I was doing pretty well with the GI Bill and scholarship. So, but I went down for an interview, and just so I could, understand that this was a technology in real use at the time. And I told them, I couldn't do this. And about 3 weeks later, they called and they said, well, we've accepted all your conditions. So I said, well, so I worked for about 4 months full-time, and then interviewed Chris Miller, who was on one of the earlier interviews. And then I stayed in touch with Chris, and then came back to work for Polymetrics in 1976. So,
Walter?
Okay. I graduated from Vanderbilt University with a degree in electrical engineering in 1967. After that, I went to Cape Canaveral and worked in the missile industry. It's in underwater acoustics, involved with locating missile body impacts, mainly. And after that, I worked for Gould, which had a division that made torpedoes, and worked on torpedo systems for a while. And then went to work for Bechtel in San Francisco in their mining and metals division. And so I got involved in industrial process control at that point in time. And then in, I think it was May of 1978, I went to work for Polymetrics. So that's where I got into the reverse osmosis business.
Good, thank you. So another Bechtel alumni. Yes. I am also. I was in the power division. So, who was there at Polymetrics first? You?
No, Mike.
Mike was there
Mike.
first.
72.
72. So tell us a little about the early days and some of the characters that were there. The biggest character, of course,
Well,
being
yeah, they're all
Mr.
characters.
Grunow.
Dave Grunow.
Starting Dave Grunow, and Tim Clark, who's then ended up in Malta and stuff. But it was at the time they were up in Redwood City in one of those little roll-up garage door things where you could walk in, and they had a little office in the side. They were only there for 2 years, and then they moved to Corbin, where these guys joined us. The biggest story I can remember from when we were there is back then the cellulose acetate membranes were very expensive, and also only 4-inch. And there was only like 1 or 2 leaves in them, as I remember. And 2 leaves, yeah. And and I hadn't been there very long, and it was February, March, and they brought one of the membranes in, and they would always dye test them with this purple dye, and then if they had failed, they would then destructively tear them apart. So we had one rolled out in the park, literally in the parking lot, because that was the only place big enough. And you see all this green scum, slime on the top, and everybody stands around very knowingly. Yep, algae fouling again. So, and I was thinking, first it's February, and second, I think that's a well water. And I took some samples of it and analyzed. It was almost pure iron oxide. But the cartridge filters were completely clean. And it turned out the pump, it was a cast iron pump with the spider bearings, and they were adding the acid right in front of the pump and just dissolving the pump off into the membrane. And the purple dye was reacting with the iron and forming a green color. So it was, I think I still have that spider bearing somewhere in there.
So this was your first exposure to materials.
Yes. I don't know what at the cost of those membranes out, that 4-inch is probably equivalent to $2,000 or something in today's dollars.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. They were very expensive. And I remember when we built Sanibel, I paid Hydronautics, I think, $1,400 an element.
Yeah.
And that was in 1979. So they've come down, well, of course, it's hard to find a CA spiral anymore.
Yeah.
So having got a degree in civil engineering, did you get any exposure to RO as part of the...
No. In the text, you could read in the textbook that about the theory, and it was so it was quite amazing to actually see a company actually doing it, Polymetrics. I think the first plant I think was for IBM, I think in South San Jose.
because that was, you were mostly doing ultra
It was all
water, rinse water.
Yeah,
right?
we were just cleaning the water up prior to the ion exchange system, basically.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was wild times though.
So Jim, you started at Roga.
Yes.
So you were heavily involved in membranes for many years.
Right.
Before you went to Polymetrics.
Even before Roga, it was interesting. I was working on another project at General Atomic. And General Atomic, every year they'd go out and hire as many PhDs as they could, bring them in and give them a lab and an office and say, go find a project to work on. Fund yourself. And one of the things they found was the Office of Saline Water was giving money for membrane development. So about 3 labs down from where I was working, there was a fellow in there working with reverse osmosis membranes, he was working on maple sap. And he had sap on the hallways, and the doorways. I mean, this was really a mess. And it wasn't only about 6 months later that I was asked to join the RO group on a temporary basis in January 1969 to take a demonstration plant to Kuwait. So I went in January '69, joined the group, and got my exposure on acid mine drainage and sewage treatment and membrane development. Went to Kuwait and came back and never went back to my other job. So just stayed with it. Here I am, many years later.
So who was working on the maple sap?
Oh, it was one of the fellow's name was Jack Schultz. Jack Schultz. He's no longer in. He didn't stay long with the group.
You had a pretty varied background.
Yes, it did.
And what attracted you to Polymetrics?
Well, I thought it was an interesting new technology, at least new to me. I guess their previous electrical person had left, and so they were in need of somebody to do the electrical and controls, and I wound up being that person. Initially, there were no large projects for me to work on, as I recall, but they had a line of packaged units, standard units, and there were some problems with the controls in them. They generally worked okay, but they just had some minor problems of one sort or another. I recall one problem was the control panel. There was a disconnect switch inside with a handle on the front where you would open and close the switch. And that handle wasn't very suitable for the application, and often a lot of water would leak in around the handle, and sometimes the handle would be totally removed by the operator and people would reach in and turn the thing on and off. So that was one thing to try to fix, try to come up with a better design.
Yeah, water and electricity don't mix very well. In one of the earlier sessions, we were talking about the first seawater plant in Bermuda, at the Bermuda Aviation Services, and Bob Wright was saying that you got the early unit, and after about 5 years, the only thing that was left was the frame. And were you involved in that?
No, I was at Stanford at the time.
It was before me also.
Yeah.
Me too.
So none of you can lay claim to having chosen the wrong
not
materials.
Not on that
I'm sure we
not
were.
on that project.
Yeah, I'm sure we repeated the mistake, but I'm not sure.
So what was the first big, and in those days big was 500,000 gallons a day, what was the first big municipal project that you did?
Sarasota.
And
City of Sarasota?
And that's how I came to Polymetrics.
The Sarasota?
Yes.
You worked on that project?
Yes.
And that was B9s?
Yep. Yeah.
And has been totally rebuilt since then.
I would imagine.
Oh, probably. Yeah.
It's now a spiral plant. But I remember talking to, you probably remember his name, it's the project manager for the engineering company.
Yes, George Komrak, who changed his name to George Milton.
Milton,
I think he was Hungarian or something, wasn't he?
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
Yugoslavian or
Yeah, something like that.
He didn't change his accent, just
No,
his name.
Changed his name.
I can remember him, and those pumps that were put in there were aluminum bronze, as I recall, the original vertical turbine pumps. And I can remember having a big argument with him about the suitability of the material. And he said stainless steel is absolutely the wrong thing to have in an RO
He was
plant.
very opinionated about quite a few things. He made us buy, and probably the only installation in the United States or in the world that had stainless steel Victaulic clamps.
Oh, yeah. We had especially,
I recall, I think
I
Jim...
didn't even know you could get stainless
They had
steel
to be special.
Victaulics in
They
those
had to be
days.
special made by Victaulic for us. They cost an arm and a leg,
I bet
but
they
he
did.
insisted that they be stainless steel.
Spectrum,
The thing had a large walk-in control panel with a bench board front on it, and we were trying to. It had electrical, mechanical, relay logic, and some analog controllers, of traditional electronic ones of the era. And I know at one point, Jim and I was trying to convince the guy we should use a programmable controller, which instead of the electrical, mechanical logic, but he was not to be convinced. However, I think once he saw the panel, he said, "Well, where is the programmable controller?" So, but anyhow,
And that was what, 73 or 79?
It was pretty early for programmable controllers. They were costly, and it was in the transition
I
phase.
think we had one of the first ones at Sanibel about at the same time. It's the old Texas Instruments.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, we knew that the project was going to go for, the construction was going to go for some number of months. So Fred Miller, who's in our field service, he found us a place in the 14th hole in the golf course there in Sarasota because it turned out it was a lot cheaper than renting a hotel for 4 or 5 months for a bunch of guys. And then he, since he knew he was going to be out down there for 5 months, he wanted to have his airplane down there. So we took off on a Friday without telling anybody. Showed up, Monday afternoon in Florida. It's easier to get forgiveness than permission.
Yeah. So when, after that, you did
Yambu was the next.
Yambu was the
next
next one?
Yep.
And that was one of the first big seawater plants, right?
It wasn't that large. It wasn't that
No,
large.
but for seawater, it
At
was.
the time,
yeah,
it was
for
pretty,
seawater,
pretty,
it
it
was
was
pretty
supposed to be
good.
5,000 cubic meters a day or something. Yeah. And it
And
turned out,
what did you learn from Yambu?
You
drill the
learned
wells first.
you can't desalt 78,000 TDS water very well, or 60,000 TDS water, whatever it was.
Yeah, that was, we were about a quarter mile inland where we drilled the wells, and I think they came in around 55,000 is my recollection. So instead of being 5,000, it was 3,000. We had to really cut the recovery back and stuff.
What sort of
There was some
recoveries did you use in those days?
Oh, it probably started out at
20% or something.
Yeah, I think by the time we were done, it was down around 20.
20%?
I think it was 35 by design, but by the time we were done, it was not. Yeah.
I had a fair amount of trouble with corrosion of the well pumps, at least early on.
Yeah,
There were
corrosion.
submersible pumps, and they corroded away pretty rapidly.
Corrosion of everything there,
Yeah.
piping, all pumps. Jeez.
Yeah, that was. I remember reading or listening to a paper many years ago, and it said that one of the biggest problems you had was with the piping corrosion.
We had one of the fellows there, I think he was from Tunisia or someplace, one of the operators, and he was very adept at wrapping twine, little like rope, like you'd have on a ship around the railing. He wrapped the piping with that to keep it from squirting out so much.
Very looked good.
Yeah, it looked good.
But that was kind of an emergency project. I mean, they were supposed to have a thermal plant, but it was about 2 years behind schedule. So my recollection is this was only supposed to have run for 2 or 3 years, just for the construction camp to have water until the evaporator.
Well, the nice thing about that project, of course, it was a 180-day turnkey job in Saudi Arabia, Yambu. And we,
Yambu wasn't close to anything in those
no,
days.
up to, what was this, 50 or, how many, 75 miles north of
350 kilometers, 200 miles north of Jeddah.
Jeddah, yeah.
Yeah.
Anyhow,
350 broken down cars, as I remember.
Chris
Counted
Miller,
them.
Chris Miller waved his magic wand on that one, and we made water on the 179th day. Impossible to do again.
Yeah, very hard. It's one of those situations where they started off saying, well, the power is down the road here, half a mile. That's the starting point for your power source, and it's 13 kV. Good luck. But we had.
So how did you deal with a situation like that?
Well, we dug a trench and buried a 13 kV cable down the road until we got to the plant site. Put in a few. I think we had a pair initially of maybe 1.5 MVA pad mounts and a motor control center inside, and then individual control panels for each unit, because it was such a big rush to try to get it done quickly. And then later, I think we added 2 more. I think I had 5 units at the end or something. Had some more added later, and we put in another transformer and some more motor control center, and then some more identical panels as well.
So did they make you make your own connection to the 13 kV?
Well, fortunately, it was a pad mount switch there, which we could use an unused part of. So
Amateur lineman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Later, they had the additional well pumps needed were some distance away, and that was a little bit of a minor problem power-wise, but it worked out. It was very quick.
So in those days, who else, apart from the people we've already interviewed, who else was at Polymetrics that we may not have heard about, or was like a backroom guy who did significant work on projects?
We actually brought a number of the shop guys over, and for the construction.
Uh-huh.
So, and I think other than working the 12-hour days, 6-7 days a week, I think they really enjoyed it. We had Rick Henniger and Rudy Schmidt was there, and a number of the guys. And one day a week, they'd go out to the coast up north and go snorkeling and stuff in the Red Sea, which is just dramatic snorkeling. It's like nobody's ever been in the water, it felt like, up there with the coral and stuff. But I'm actually surprised we didn't lose 1 or 2 of them, because these tapestry shells, they didn't realize how poisonous they were, and they were sticking them in their pants and bringing them home, and they were still alive with a stinger. So, yeah.
Now, we heard a story about you, Mike, in connection with that project. There was an official with SWIC that was giving you a hard time.
Probably, yeah.
And you commented one day that you'd like to kill him, and Rudy said, "I'll do it."
No, yeah, that's right. Yeah, I forgot about that. And he was serious. I'll do it on my way to the airport. Yeah, actually, I thought I was only going over for 2 weeks for the O&M, set up part of the O&M, and as I was on the flight over, the project manager, I got thrown out of the country, and I was the only one with a visa, so I ended up, 5 months instead of 2 weeks. So,
Some of us have had all those experiences, haven't they, Mike?
but there was, we had one guy that we had. There was a lot of drinking, surprisingly, in the third country nationals, and there was one guy that I said I was going to fire, and the way that the telephone system worked is you had to call into the main switchboard, and then some faceless people would make the connection to the U.S. And all you have is a number when you called in. So I call in, I said, blah, blah, blah. And the guy goes, "Are you really going to fire so-and-so?" And I'm thinking, this is my only communication to the outside world.
So you said no.
I said, I haven't decided yet. He rambled on about, oh yeah, he's got all these problems. I never knew, had no clue who I was talking to. Never did.
And these were Saudi guys or
Contractor.
contractors?
I think these were actually Filipinos at the telephone center, I think. Yeah.
Right. So you were one of the first kids on the block with RO. But shortly after then, there's some competition welled up.
Fluid Systems put a plant in Jeddah before we put the one in Yanbu.
Yeah. That was, what was that, 77? The Jeddah plant?
I think so.
78?
I think
Something
so,
like that. Yeah. But when you started to get, you had Permuted sitting there who was also a DuPont licensee, and they didn't last very long.
But they didn't do any overseas work.
They didn't do any overseas work.
Not that I'm aware.
And there was, in Florida, there was Paul Collar started Basic Technologies. Yep. And so that was probably competition for you. After a while, you just pulled out of that market altogether.
No, we pulled out. I don't think we were.
Well, you did Sarasota
Yeah.
and Venice.
Venice,
and then you
Venice
had,
was before.
We were always struggling
Venice
for
was
money.
before Sarasota.
Yeah.
Venice was before.
And then
Sarasota.
ultimately Malta was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you seem to concentrate more on seawater. You went the seawater route rather than.
There were a lot of brackish water.
And UltraPure, we did a lot of
UltraPure work, right?
UltraPure work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then what was it? Arrowhead had a huge monopoly in the UltraPure market at the time, and they had to divest themselves of 40%, and the Polymetrics management, whatever, purchased it. And that, in some ways, that was kind of the beginning of the end for the custom projects, I think, because all of a sudden the focus was there's a lot more attention on the DI water and DI service and stuff. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Right. You made some fairly significant technical advances, I think, in the technology, one of which was the energy recovery device, which was developed, I guess, while you were all still there. Or initially developed while you were all still
we
there.
had we had a contract with OWRT, and to demonstrate, I guess it was proof of concept, demonstrate that it, the mechanics of that it could be done. And it was Bill Andrews and Chris Miller. And I think we probably got it at a low period where we needed work, and then everything got fairly busy, and we weren't making progress on it as fast as we should have been. And the contract officer called a meeting, and I wasn't at it, but Chris he may have related this story the other day, and he was just frustrated at the lack of progress. And finally he goes, and if you want us to pay you, you have to bill us. Because we hadn't even bothered to send we haven't even sent them a bill for the thing.
Now, Walter, you worked on that quite a bit as well, didn't you?
A good bit, yes. Dick Hardipy did most of the mechanical engineering on it, and I did the electrical and controls. It was at an era when programmable controllers were still pretty expensive and intended for bigger systems. So one of the struggles, and I think Bill Andrews actually had involved in this initially, and was to have a device that, it was a system that went through a sequence of events over and over and over again, somewhat like washing a filter or something, where you go through this particular sequence. So we used a drum switch or stepper switch to step the thing through the sequence. The challenge was that in that era, the stepper switches were designed for maybe 25,000 revolutions, and they would fall apart because they were often in systems that would backwash once a day, or whatever it was being used for. It was an infrequent thing, a sequence, And this thing would cycle maybe 2 or 3 times a minute, so it didn't take too long until the stepper switch was pretty sick and had to be replaced. But it did work and it functioned, at least for the purpose of proof of concept. A few years later, when small programmable controllers became economical, then replacing the drum switch with a programmable controller solved those issues. And then it became, electrically, the system was control-wise, pretty straightforward and fairly trouble-free. It became then a matter of dealing with the hydraulics, the valves, and other things that tended to not be so tolerant of the high cycle rate that the thing had.
You started off, as we've heard, using Roga membranes?
No, Polymetric started using B9s.
So we started out
Some Roga also, but
for the ultra pure, the early days, the ultra pure was Roga.
In 72. We were, and then we went to the B9s.
B9s,
and I think they forced us to have kind of an exclusive relationship unless it was spec'd, or unless there was some reason the B9 could not be used. They put a fair amount of pressure on.
And then that was, for the rest of the time that you were all there, that was pretty much all you used was DuPont.
Almost exclusively, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a,
And what was dealing with DuPont like?
Well, the one thing, the thing I would say that I personally benefited from is their design manual was pretty good. It's hard to imagine now that we were doing all these calculations by hand, and even the HP 35 didn't come out till late 70s or something. And they had a really nice set of graphs and things where you could do the designs. And the older Gulf Atomic, they had actually a fairly large manual, but very difficult to use for trying to design. You didn't run 100 projections to optimize something. You made your best guess and did 2 or 3 points.
Yeah, that was a good manual.
Yeah.
And I think they revised it 2 or 3 times before they finally quit the business.
Yeah. But sometimes they were a little cavalier, like they set a limit of an SDI of 3, and we were having we were under 3 in one project, and it was and still fouling. And he goes, "Well, just reduce it to 1." Oh, okay. Okay.
Do you have any tips on how to do that?
Yeah. So.
Well, even some of the early plants in the States, they found that the retention size of the cartridge holders was important. And there was a big difference between a 5 micron, which everybody was using, and a 1 micron. And a lot of the B9 systems worked a lot better with a 1 micron system. Yeah.
Well, I think there was an ideal membrane for Saudi because that aquifer for the brackish water was really clean, so they worked really well on that. So.
I remember visiting a small mobile home park just north of Venice in the Comus, and there was a Polymetrics unit there, and the owner was actually, that was when I first met Jimmy Hahn, because he had just started business. He showed up, these 2 guys showed up, and they were in singlets and shorts and had hand-painted Hahn RO system on the door of his truck, and they were working on a well. The well apparently had overdrafted and sucked air, and the whole poly unit was clogged with sulfur. And the owner had no water, and he was really desperate. And I think Jimmy went in and built him a small plant in about 3 weeks or something like that, so he could at least have some water. But that was in Florida at least, that was a problem with the B9s in a lot of places, that they were so sensitive that if you got any air in the system at all, I mean, it was all over. And you didn't, I guess, you don't really have that problem with seawater, except in some places where it's from wells and there's some hydrogen sulfide in the wells.
Yeah, and as long as you can just keep it, and it actually, we had one on in Grand Cayman with hydrogen sulfide in the water, and those membranes went 10 years without being cleaned. And so as long as you can completely keep the oxygen out here.
I was asking
works
Bill
really well.
Andrews earlier, when I was at Sanibel, and we took bids on the original RO plant Sanibel. The Polymetrics bid, and I didn't know much in those days. But was anybody else building seawater RO systems at that time? I mean, seriously.
I don't know. We were on the engineering side.
You didn't get involved with it.
We only knew when we won.
So, you all spent time at project sites. Do you have any interesting stories you'd like to share with us that are memorable, like getting stuck in the desert without a truck or something like that?
Oh, I got 1,000, but
I remember one time, this was at Malta, where, in the early 80s we did this project in Malta, a seawater plant. When you came down the only road access to it, you kind of came down this hill and you could see down below the plant, which is built near the water but up on some high cliffs above the water. And they had a well field and had a break tank for the feed water, and then there were pumps that pumped that under 70 or 80 psi into the cartridge filter system and then into the membrane, the pumps for the membrane. Anyway, the line between the brake tank and the pumping system related it and the main plant was kind of above grade, or right at grade anyway. And one day I remember coming down the hill and there was this massive fountain where the line had popped. It was about a 30-inch fiberglass line, and it was shooting. It was one of those nice big leaks that often happened in these seawater plants.
that reminds me, we were doing a project out in Bora Bora, and we'd finished the construction. We were getting ready to start it up, and the engineer for the hotel was a German who'd migrated out there, and the contractor was a New Caledonian contractor. And so we're all about this close to this pipe, and at eye level there's a PVC coupling, and you could see this little bead of water form, run down the pipe, form, run down the pipe. And the German guy goes, this leaks. And the New Caledonian guy goes, no, it doesn't. And I'm trying to keep a straight face. And of course the German guy louder, this leaks. And he goes, no, it doesn't. And I could hardly stand up at that point. And after he said it the third time, the guy goes, just a little.
So you, so when did you leave Polymetrics, Jim?
Jeez.
84.
Was it? Okay.
Yep.
84, right?
And you left in 84?
84.
And you left in 84. And you went off to Aqua Design, right?
Yep.
And that was that?
Well, actually, it was
What?
first before Aqua Design was a precursor was DVT.
Yeah, we were
The precursor to Aqua Design was DVT.
It's DVT?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For about, a year or two.
yeah, for the project in Misurata. Yeah.
And also the one in Aruba. Bonaire. Bonaire was DVT.
Oh, okay.
So what did DVT stand for?
It was a German company.
Deutsche Verfahrenstechnik,
Okay.
or something roughly like that. My pronunciation is probably not.
So Chris got the funding from him, so that was what the company was called for a while.
Was that the company that had the plate heat
Yes,
exchanger?
yeah.
Okay.
The cross-flow plate heat exchanger.
It's owned by an Egyptian?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was headquartered in Dusseldorf, Germany.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, Dave Grunow was very
Yes,
friendly with that
Dave,
guy.
Dave,
Yeah.
Dave and Chris, right?
And I think we put in I think it was the first commercial work exchanger there in '86 in Bonaire. I'm not sure if Bill put in one before that or not, but I think that was the first one, the first word exchange that we hadn't perfected it then either, but we certainly
Put it
hadn't
in anyway.
perfected it back at Polymetrics.
So then after DVT, then came Aqua Design. And that was one of probably the first, if not the first, boot-oriented RO companies.
Yep.
And what motivated that move, go from building plants to selling water?
I think a part of it was just being in the right place at the right time. We gotten the experience at Polymetrics and various things, but there were a number of people that were selling seawater plants to hotels and stuff in the Caribbean, and a lot of them weren't working, and so that gave us so it put the hotels in a position where they didn't want to have the risk of buying this thing, and so we were able to just say, we'll take all the risk and we'll sell the water, and you just pay for the water. And we were just in the right place at the right time, and could do it. That was
I think the hotel management, if they can get rid of any technical issues in their life, they're happy to turn those over to others. They're more people than.
And then your financing came from Mitsui, so that's when you started using spiral membranes.
On the big, that's when we started with Toray.
Yeah.
Because Mitsui was the Toray, rep in the U.S.
Right. The Toray membranes perform well?
Even at that time, I think they performed well. Now, obviously, they're quite good, but they had this PEC 1000, and the membrane performed extremely well, except that it was sensitive to oxygen. So it's kind of a fatal flaw. So deaerating the water was a big problem. But we didn't. It didn't take Mitsui very long to decide. The membranes are a small part of the project, and they were interested in the projects, fortunately, and so we used a lot of film tech membranes for a while until Toray caught up in the technology, in the seawater technology.
So how many of the old Polymetrics folks were involved in Aqua Design?
I think, we certainly handpicked all the best, these two to start with.
Mike Bachman, Amy Knapp.
Amy Knapp was there.
Rudy Schmidt,
Rudy was there.
the Hennigers, and the guys,
the
shop guys were.
Several of the shop guys.
And between Rudy and Mike Bachman, the design drafters, they could turn out the two of them could turn out as much work as 8 people at Polymetrics. So we were really lucky in the staff.
But you were still headquartered here.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. You didn't. I mean, you didn't move to the Caribbean.
No.
Except Dean.
Except Dean. Yeah.
Well, Dean came here.
He was here for 3 or 4 years.
Yeah. And there was as I recall, there was a Culligan dealer down there who built who was a competitor, I guess, of yours in some of the early boot projects. Can't remember his name. It's a Dutch fella. He was from.
In Saint Martin.
Yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember his name either. Yeah. Guys. I think they got the follow-on contract. We took the plant over from Aqua Chem. Yeah.
And then the big move was when you were bought by Ionics.
That was Aqua Design. Yeah.
Yeah. And then came Trinidad.
And then came Trinidad.
And did you all work on Trinidad?
Yeah.
I used to work part-time for a couple of weeks, a couple of months. That was all.
Yeah. I think in some ways I think we benefited because Tampa was being bid almost simultaneously, and everybody was focused. Everybody really thought Tampa, that's the star that everybody wanted, and Trinidad actually was bigger.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
But probably at least as difficult or more difficult because of the way that the salinity would vary from 15 or 20,000 to 35,000.
Yeah.
And sometimes
Chris was saying that the conditions were very similar to Tampa Bay, in the variable salinity, varying temperature, and so on. So, but you apparently managed to deal with that much better than the folks did in Tampa Bay.
Well, Tampa Bay, they had the fouling problem. That was
Yeah.
a big problem, wasn't it?
Yeah,
It wasn't
pre-treatment.
It wasn't the salinity, it was the fouling,
was the
right?
problem in Tampa Bay. Yeah. So after that, when you left Polymetrics, Jim, what did you do?
Went to work for Korea.
Oh, from a Japanese
Mhm.
company, Kurita. And how long were you doing with them?
Oh, 5 years, I guess. And then we opened an office here in San Jose, Krita America, and operated out of here. We did 4 ultra-pure water projects in the United States. And then they moved the office to Dallas, and I said, sayonara.
You didn't
I
fancy
had to go-
moving to Dallas?
I had to go to Dallas.
How about going to Texas?
I fully retired then. Right.
And Mike, what about you? I know you're still pretty
Same
active.
thing. When they bought, when Ionics bought us, they moved the engineering office to Boston, and we said, sayonara. And they said, well, you can stay in California then. And then, of course, GE bought Ionics, and I'm still, I'm not sure if I've been in the same job for 20, 30 years, or I haven't moved locations. I just changed employers. Yeah.
And you're still working for them.
I nominally retired 3 years ago.
Did you?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And then I worked on a couple projects down in Australia for them, for GE, and we're currently working, or consulting to Montgomery Watson for the D-cell project in Monterey.
Uh-huh.
So it'd be nice to have a project close enough to drive home at night. That'd be the way to
But
end a
you also,
career.
didn't you work on the Hammer project in Algeria?
Yeah.
That was a pretty large plant, as I recall.
200,000, about 55 million gallons a day,
Yeah.
I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's up and running, and everything's going okay.
As far as I know, it is they had horrendous problems with the intake and the pre-treatment, and on the intake they were supposed to chlorinate it, out at the end, and originally they were going to run the chlorine line outside the intake, and these are 3 48-inch pipes, and the contractor decided to run it inside, and apparently somewhere along the line the pipe broke about a third of the way out, and so they were measuring chlorine at the intake, but of course there wasn't any chlorine 2/3 of the length of the pipe, and they were watching the water level over a few months keep dropping and dropping and dropping in Clearwell, and they took out 55 tons of shells. They said
55 tons?
that was the number that was reported to me.
Good Lord.
So, and it looks like they're going to have to continue to do that periodically. The fouling on the intake was really bad.
Do they have a pigging system on that line so they could pig it periodically?
It was supposed to have had one, but the infrastructure was set up for it, and then it was never completed, is my understanding. Yeah.
And Walter, what are you doing these days?
I'm retired at the moment. But,
How come everybody's retired except me? I don't understand. And David. David's not retired yet. I don't understand that. It's not fair. Obviously, I should have gone on the hardware side of the business, made all the money, and then I could have retired. This poor old consulting engineer,
Right.
just plodding along here.
It's also called age, Ian. I'm going to trade a few years, I'll trade you a few years.
So, when did you retire, Walter?
about 5 years ago, after GE bought Ionics, things wound down. I did some consulting work for their operation in Tampa with some seawater systems in the Caribbean, designing things, and also for Dean Bedford's operation in Gainesville for some years. But finally, I decided that I designed enough RO plants. It was time to stop, so I quit.
Well, you had your background and your work experience before Polymetrics had nothing to do with water, except maybe the torpedoes.
They were in water.
Having joined Polymetrics, Do you have any regrets about going into the RO business?
No, I think it's been very interesting. I've enjoyed designing the plants and seeing them, and around the world, different spots. So it was good. So I don't really regret that. It's been a good experience.
Mike, how about you?
Well, one thing I commented
You
on
started out as a civil engineer.
Yeah.
So.
but in Walt's case, I mean, in a lot of ways, he was really responsible for a lot of the success because the quality of our instrumentation and control systems, was really, all of a sudden he just brought a level of professionalism to the thing that, our panels, I'm sure, were way better than all the other stuff I had seen in the field at the time. So.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's basically a pretty simple system as long as you've got your hydraulics right. The rest of it depends almost entirely on the control system.
Yeah. But just the quality of the material selected and things. There's a lot of things that can go wrong corrosion-wise and everything else.
Yeah.
And I think he saved us from ourselves a lot of times.
It was a pretty hard learning curve on materials, though, especially on seawater.
Yeah.
Tough.
From some of the stories I hear that the learning curve is still going on for some people.
I don't know about that. So.
Stick that read history once in a while, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah. So you have no regrets, Mike?
Yeah. For me, it worked out very well. Between the, travel, I mean, now I'm not so excited about traveling, but, the opportunity to have been to over 80 countries, and I know Walter's been to probably more than that. And,
I've only been to 65, so
60,
it has been fun.
And you started out on the membrane side, Jim.
Actually, I
started went to the equipment side. Which did you like better?
Actually, I started out in nuclear materials testing.
Oh, you did?
That's how I got to San Diego.
Okay.
I worked for Westinghouse back in Pittsburgh.
Uh-huh.
And one of the fellows I worked with came to work for General Atomic, and he recruited me. So I went to work for General Atomic doing materials testing, nuclear materials testing. And one day, one of my superiors asked me if I'd like to go to Kuwait. And I said, "What the hell is Kuwait? I don't know what Kuwait is even." I'd been to Niagara Falls and Tijuana, Mexico. That's my foreign travel. So anyhow, they said, they wanted someone to join the reverse osmosis group to take a test unit to Kuwait. And my job had been taking test units around to reactors in the United States and operating them. So they selected me for that, and that's how I got into RO, as I said earlier, and never went back after I went to Kuwait. But I think certainly the equipment side was the more exciting part of it. The membrane development was more or less of a chemistry problem, and that wasn't my background, so I was more in the materials, the equipment side.
And having made the switch, do you have any regrets about not staying on the nuclear side of things?
Well, as it turned out, the nuclear program is where is it?
That's a good career move.
Right. So no, I guess I had no regrets. No.
You have any last stories you'd like to share with us?
I have one story about Malta. We bid Malta, and I worked on the proposal for Malta and the cost estimating and so on, and we got the contract. And I was home, I think it was right around Christmas. And someone called me and said, "We get on a plane and go to Malta for a couple of days, a week or so." We got the contract, we're going to go over there. So I go over there and landed and went out to the site, and Bill Andrews is there, and Mike Bachman. And Bill Andrews and Mike Bachman said, "We're going to put the plant right here on this site and so on. It's going to be dump, dump, and dump, dump, dump." And they left. And there I was for 3 months. So, yep, good experience.
Yeah.
Mike, how about you?
No, although when when I first they started talking about the polymetrics and the things, it's interesting. I don't remember, the projects really don't stand out. It's all the experiences with the people on the sites and things it's all the stories that I remember. Right? It's not the technology, not the projects that I really remember.
Yeah. Yep. Walt?
Well, I recall at Malta, we had power coming into the plant was 11 kV feed, 50 hertz system, of course. And the Malta, which was the power company, only had they had some feeders out in that part of the island, but none of them, no one of them had enough capacity to run the plant. So they said, well, we'll give you 2 feeders. And so you need to set up with 2 incoming lines. You'll have to load both of them. You can't just use one or the other. So fortunately, we're working with a British electrical engineer, John Whiteley, who was very skilled and had a lot of third world experience. So he said, okay, what we need is a serious tap switch automatic tap switch on the primary side of this transformer. And he was certainly right. I think it would go plus 5% to minus 20% voltage. It would compensate over that range. And we were often at minus 10 or minus 15% for the compensation. I mean, where as you loaded the thing up, the feeder would get lower and lower and lower. But we were able to extract enough power from it and keep the 6 kV distribution within the plant at 6 kV, and that was good. And quite often we'd go to the plant and one of the feeders would be lost. I mean, this was just a routine thing. And when you went to their power plant, which was on the other side of the island, and looked through what was going on in there, you could understand why they had struggles. I mean, they did have struggles.
I was just in Malta about 3 years ago, and I went to the plant, and they had the control panel that he had built. They had just decommissioned about 4 months earlier than that and put in a PLC-based thing.
So how old was that? That
was
was
82.
82.
Yeah.
So
It actually was
29 years, 28 years.
At Malta, we had a PLC-based system originally. Of course, it's getting to be very archaic, but and ready to be scrapped certainly. It was PLC-based, and in conjunction with another system that was a data collection system for the analog signals primarily, because at that time PLCs weren't. The idea of collecting a lot of analog data and storing it and whatnot wasn't possible. So it was pretty good in that regard for the era, but 30 years later or whatever, 25 years later, it's clearly no longer very good in the world of electronics. Things are moving along.
Another project we did that was quite interesting was the one in Guantanamo.
Oh, yeah. In Morro Bay.
Dave Grunow thought that the Navy was looking for a fix for their desal plants down there, which they couldn't start anymore because they couldn't put enough sawdust in them to plug the holes.
Yeah,
So
they were
they-
all thermal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they had one from, the original one, of course, was from the one at San Diego. So they went out for this emergency bid and emergency plant, and we bid on it. And we bid against Hydronics, I think.
And it turned out we were the only bidder, because
Well,
that
anyhow,
later caused us
we-
a huge problem.
We got the job, and I think we got it in, October, November. And we said we'd be making water at the end of March.
Yeah, 5 months.
So
We did.
Walt and I were down there when the earthquake hit here. We were down looking at the site and trying to figure out what we were going to do and so on. And then we came home and sent a couple other people, Peter Smith down and a couple other people, to try to drill. We had hired a contractor to drill wells on the site, which came up dry. So we then tapped off of their line. But it was at, I think, January, right around Christmas time, I got a call from the commanding officer down there. He said, Mr. Sleigh, he said, I understand you have a contract to put a desal plant in for us. I said, that's right, sir. He said, it's going to be operating by the end of March. I said, that's right, sir. He said, but it's now January. There's nobody here. There's nothing going on. I said, that's right, sir. I said, we'll get it done. So we subcontracted out building the 2 RO racks to a company up in Washington and trucked them down here, trucked them to Atlanta, I think it was Atlanta. And one of our president at that time had a contact, and we got him to put them on the C-5A spy planes, flew them into Guantanamo, 4 plane worth, 4 20-foot containers, 2 with RO membranes, 1 with the control panel, control
Yeah, the
system,
full, yeah.
everything in there. And then the other one was all the spare materials. And the spare material one ran around 40,000 pounds, I guess, the plane down there and didn't get off the runway with it. But anyhow, we got them all down there, trucked them all over, and put them on the site. And by the end of March, we were making water. The Navy people used to, we took almost everybody from Aqua Design, shipped them down there. We also got 8 operators from Thailand. Flew them in, brought them in. And everybody was there putting this plant together, and the Navy people would just walk by and shake their heads every day at us. But we got it done.
That's right. And we did, and Morro Bay was back around 90, 91, when they were having the drought here, and we had the contract, and we agreed to guaranteed we'd have water in 97 days. 600,000 gallon a day. We made it.
Yep.
That's one thing we were great at doing, to make these big promises.
Yeah, we,
And then have to live up to them.
But it sounds like most of the time you lived up to it.
Started with Yambu, that was the first one. Yep.
Well, it
We
makes
never-
life interesting when
Oh.
you have a challenge like that.
Yep.
That's great. Well, I want to thank you all for coming. It's
Okay.
been, actually, all three
yeah.
interviews have been very interesting.
Okay.
I was reminding Dave that I met him shortly after I moved down to Florida in 1977, and I thought he was one of the strangest guys I've ever met in my life.
You were probably right.
So, thanks very much indeed.